I can remember when war was declared, Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister, and I can remember we were all standing round by the radio saying, listening, and he was saying, I have had no reply, and so we are now at war. The air raid sirens sounded a few minutes later, and so we got our gas masks out. Anyway, it was a false alarm. It was unidentified aircraft coming to the country. And then I can remember red buses. I'd never seen red buses come down from London, the evacuees, and we had an evacuee, Lenny Etherington. But of course, nothing much happened at first, and they all drifted back. In any case, if they lived in the suburbs when the Battle of Britain really started the Blitz, they concentrated on the centre of London, although, of course, they dropped bombs everywhere. And we had a bomb dropped just behind our house, and we lived on this side of the brook in St John's Road, and there was a bank this side, so that took most of the blast. A high bank about 4 metres higher than the other side. But the other side, there was a parade of shops, butchers, greengrocers, drapers, and all the rest of it. I used to get on very well with the cup because I used to go around for a penn'orth of chips or two penn'orth of chips, whatever it was, to Mr. and Mrs. Jenner, who always made a fuss of me as a little boy. And I can remember going out in my back garden after the bomb had dropped. We'd lost our windows and all that, but the house was still there. But over the other side of the brook, everything was totally demolished. And I can remember them being brought out dead. And I was about 10 years old, and it made me cry. And things like that, you know. And then later in the war, I always remember we were Doodlebug dropped, and we had laths and plaster ceilings, and a lump of plaster came down on my forehead and just cut it slightly. And the first aid wardens, they used to wear white tin hats. They were over enthusiastic. They weren't medically trained in any way, and they put a 4-inch bandage around my head, and all it needed was a little plaster because it was only a scratch, really. But that was my war wound. And I always laugh about it now because I wasn't really all that way, you know. But my sister was a sergeant in the WAFs. My brother Peter trained as a pilot, and my other brother was in the Merchant Navy. But they saw probably less action than I did, in a sense. You know what I mean? They were there and they were in the forces. I wouldn't say it about my younger brother because he's 5 years older than me, but he was in the Merchant Navy, and I think he saw ships, you know, because they used to go in convoys. You know why they went in convoys? Because if there's a submarine in the Atlantic and a single ship goes down, you get him. But if there's a convoy, you probably get 2 of 10. And then, of course, most of the crews would be picked up by the other ships. But it was a terrible time, really, you know, when you think about all these things and the people that suffered. And, you know, we went through it. You know, we lived in shelters and things like this, and we went till they built shelters. They closed the schools, but we used to have to go and get some homework every day. Go up with and you'd go home and do it in 20 minutes as a rule, and so the education was limited as well. Everything that you can think of was affected, and then of course there was severe rationing. So we only got, I think, 2 ounces of butter a week or something like that, and various other things. Always remember, if you had margarine, you were allowed more. So we had margarine because 2 ounces of butter wouldn't go very far. And everything, right from bread and everything else, was rationed. After the Doodlebug, which was towards the end of the war, the first one I was telling you about was the Battle of Britain bombs, or from aircraft, and then the Doodlebugs at the end of the war, they didn't last long because they were sent by launching pads on the French coast, and once D-Day had happened, they couldn't launch them because we'd taken over the coast. But they were pretty terrible, and we had one there that killed a lot of other people, and that's when it frightened my parents, and so I was evacuated for 4 months of the war. They took us all down to South Wales, and we were put in the hall of a school, in the middle, and the locals said, I'll have that one, I'll have that one. But I can't complain about the care I had. We had good care. But when you think of some of the things that happened, it's quite amusing, really. And then we used the hall of it was in Pyle in South Wales, hall of the local school, their assembly hall room. And we had the girls' school up one end of it, and we were down the other end of the hall. And our ages ranged from about 7 to 13, and you had one teacher, Mr. What was his name? I can't think of his name now, but he was a wonderful man. But you can imagine I was 13, and he was trying to teach 8-year-olds and me as well. So the education wasn't very good either. But we put up with it, and the people I was evacuated with were all right. I mean, most of them did it because they got paid for doing it, taking evacuees. A lot of them did it to increase their income. In thinking about, I used to go to church. I belonged to St. John's Church all my life. Christened, what do you call it? Confirmed, yeah. And in South Wales, it was nearly all chapels. I can remember as a boy of, what I've been, I suppose, 13, reading the lesson in a Welsh chapel. There's probably half a dozen chapels in the village, I would have thought nearly. Some were Welsh speaking, but as the one that we went to obviously was English. Yeah. It all comes, and things that happen today, that happens to people today, you take it all in your stride. You don't really get a choice otherwise. I know, as I was saying, when the air raid siren went just a few minutes after the war was declared, we got our gas masks out ready, thinking they're going to, because that comes because Germans used gas in the First World War, and everybody thought they'd do the same in the Second, but they didn't. We enjoyed ourselves, My lifelong friend was Tony Collingwood, a Collingwood bachelor. He's my godfather of my children, and he was my best man in the reverse. And we were friends all our life, and we were evacuated together. And it made a lot of difference to have a special friend, you know what I mean? Rather than just sort of being anybody, yeah. I had my bicycle sent down by train, and somebody crossed the road fast on another bicycle nearly the first day and buckled the front wheel, and that was the end of that. It was a wreck. So I didn't get much use out of it, yeah. My father was, of course, in the First World War, but he was deafened he was in the Royal Artillery by artillery fire, and he didn't get a pension or anything, but it limited the work he could do. He'd been a fairly senior clerical job before the war. He came from Glasgow, and of course, because he was deafened, he couldn't answer the phone. He was a school caretaker for 14 years, and we weren't it was Reigate Education Committee in those days, and it was Earlswood School, they call it now. It was called Hooley School in those days, and the money was poor, and we lived, first of all, in Knighton Road in a council house, and I think we moved to St. John's Road because the rent was less in a rented house. I think, we didn't have a proper bathroom or anything else. We had an indoor toilet. A lot of people used to have to go to the top of the garden, the gate, but at the top of the garden there was the little toilet building, but we had an indoor toilet, and it went off the kitchen, which they'd never allowed today in things. And then underneath our house was cellars, and the council put in 4x4 oak wood to support the roof, the floor of the living room above. And for a time we slept in the cellars, but in time you sort of get used to it, and it hadn't happened to you, then you sleep upstairs. And the phone came in really in about 1918 or something, to be in offices and things like that. And we didn't have a phone until after the Second World War. Households didn't. You went up the road with fourpence in 2 tuppenny pieces and used the phone box. I know when the big bomb came, the doodlebug came. I was laying on the floor in the living room, and the door came down and missed my head by about 2 inches. And as I said, that's when the plaster said, but and the house was not livable, but the brickwork was there. So we went to live with my auntie in Reigate, and so I wasn't very happy there. So I was evacuated for 4 months to South Wales. Then I left school at 14. I could have, I was quite, not boasting, but I could have gone to the grammar school, and I just hated school. I mean, teachers were tyrants then. I mean, they'd be in jail today. They were treated. I can remember 2 that were really, they led by example. The others ruled by fear. The cane was used all the time. I mean, those people today would be jailed, and they were accepted as teachers, They ruled by fear, and that's how it went. Things, we put up with it. We didn't know any better. That's the answer. You mean the life you've got now is what you're experiencing. It'll be probably different in 50 years' time. There'll be no petrol cars and things like this. The world changes all the time, and you take it in as you go.